This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the Bottom Feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hey, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about leaks and leaking by the equipment. And this may sound like a kind of benign subject, but leaks are something that are really critical in the pool industry and something customers notice right away. And I'll go over some common areas where you're going to see leaks at your equipment pad. Join my coaching program and take your pool service to the next level. Connect with other pool pros in your area, gain valuable knowledge, and transform your business with personalized one-on-one advice from me. With over 36 years of experience, I'm here to help you succeed like never before. Learn more at poolguycoaching.com. I'll start with the most common leaks that I see out there, and that's somewhere around the pool pump. Sometimes these leaks will cause air to be sucked in, which would cause the pool not to prime completely. Sometimes the pool is actually priming fine with these leaks around the pump, but then when you connect your manual vacuum to vacuum it, you're going to lose suction. Or you may notice that the automatic cleaner is working for 20 seconds, then it stops, then it goes on again for 20 or 30 seconds, and it stops again. And that's because there's air getting into the pump from the leak at the pump where the water is coming out of the pump, causing the pump not to be able to pull the extra 40 feet of water. That's, basically you have the cleaner hose in there. It's got to pull the water from the head of the cleaner underwater all the way to the pump. So if it's not completely sealed, if air is getting in there because of the leak, it's going to stop the pump from priming. But sometimes there's a leak and there's really no effect on the actual pool suction at all, and it's not noticeable or a problem. So the primary area that you're going to see a leak at the pump is usually at the discharge on top. This indicates that maybe the pool ran low on water and the customer filled it up, but it ran low on water for a few hours, maybe even a couple of days, and this caused the pump to get really hot. Now I've seen pump baskets in there that look like little African shrunken heads. They've melted down to nothing, and it's really interesting to see how small they can get from the heat that's produced in the pump when there's no water in there. Certain pools have a kind of built-in fail-safe. They have a diverter valve in the skimmer. It's the UFO device, basically, that you see in there, and that if the water gets too low in the skimmer, it'll close and then it'll suck from the main drain. But a lot of older pools do not have this particular diverter that's going to be a safety mechanism, and a lot of times the pumps overheat when the pool runs low on water. So you're going to see the effect of that in the discharge. Now, the intake also may be melted as well, but I think because of physics and gravity, you're not going to see water leaking from the intake, which is the threaded part before the pump, but you're going to see the water leak from the discharge coming out the top. So it may just be like a one drop here or a trickle, and it's something that's not really a big deal. The pump may not have any problems with suction, but sometimes this leak is big enough that it's actually causing a problem with the priming. And basically the pipe, the threaded part of the pipe going in, just melted enough to let the air in and water out of that little melt from overheating. And that's kind of where that leak is on the threads of the fitting. Sometimes you can get a Granger high heat fitting and that's going to hold up better, but a lot of times it's just going to melt that plumbing because it gets so hot. How do you fix that? Well, if there's no unions, which hopefully there's unions on there, but if not, And sometimes I've seen these get so hot that the heat transfers all the way up to the unions and it kind of melts that O-ring in there. But usually those O-rings just wear out over time because there is a lot of pressure in those fittings. But basically, if there's no unions, I recommend putting unions in if you can. If not, you have to cut the pipe and unthread it and then thread a new piece in. Sometimes you don't have a lot of real estate to work with and it becomes a more difficult repair. But basically, the only way to fix that leak on top, and believe me, I've tried different tricks to try to fix it. I've tried even taking out a pipe that was on a union and putting more Teflon tape or more joint stick on there. It doesn't work. You just have to replace that part because basically it melted at a level where you can't see it with your naked eye, but there is a melt there in the threads and water's going to come out. So just replumb it. And I would also advise replumbing the intake usually at the same time if that's accessible. Sometimes just replumbing the discharge solves it, and that solves that leak right there. There's a leak that's kind of rare on pumps. Usually it doesn't happen too often, but that's at the housing gasket. So basically there's a gasket between the housing, which is the part right where the discharge is, and where the motor goes onto the back of the pump. And that's the seal plate. And basically this sometimes the O-ring there will leak. Not very common. I used to have this problem a lot with the old Duraglass and Maxi-Glass pumps out there. They kind of had the black knob and then the clamp and then the circular O-ring in there. These would overheat all the time and melt. They were really easy to change because you just unclamp it, put a new O-ring on, and that was it. But you don't have this problem too much with the square flange pumps like the Whisper Flow. Not too often are you going to see that particular gasket leaking or being a problem. So that's not something that's super common, but it can happen with certain pumps where you have that housing gasket leaking. The other part that you're going to see a leak on the pump, and this is a pretty obvious indicator that the pump seal has worn out, is a little drip from the bottom of the motor near the front. It'll be a pretty steady drip like a leaking faucet, and you're going to see the water pooled up on the ground, and it's going to be dripping directly from almost the front of the pump but near the middle, and that's an indicator that the pump seal has worn out. The only thing you can do at this point is to take the pump off the back, take off the impeller, and basically replace that pump seal. These fail when the pump gets hot again. Sometimes if the pump is getting old and getting really hot, these pump seals fail, but I've had them fail for no apparent reason at all. I'll get to a stop and I'll see that little drip at the bottom. Sometimes even in a brand new pump, you'll see this problem. So it's one of those things where you really can't say what causes it. A lot of times it is the pump getting hot, but sometimes they just leak, and that's the telltale sign that there's actually the pump seal needs to be replaced at that point. A pretty rare area around the pump that leaks is where they have the plugs to drain it, to winterize it, or the winterizing plugs. There's a little black O-ring in there. It's the same size O-ring that's in the heaters, and I'll cover that in a minute. But basically, the winterizing plug O-rings can wear out, and you'll notice like a little drip there also. Even if you tighten it up, it's still going to drip. Again, not super common because we don't use them maybe in other states it's more common where you actually open them up and use them. But here in Southern California, we never really use these things, and a lot of pool guys probably don't even know what they are on the pump. Usually on a pump, there's two of them on the bottom, one on each side, and that's actually what you use to drain the pump so that you can actually get all the water out so you can winterize it and turn the pool off and drain the water below the skimmer, do all the stuff you need to do to winterize the pool. And they can leak on occasion. So that's pretty much the pump leaks. There's not a whole lot of areas where you're going to see leaks, and sometimes it's deceiving where it's coming from. But obviously from the bottom is the pump seal, from the top is a discharge, and sometimes occasionally the top leak looks like the housing gasket, but it's not really the problem. And those are the pump leaks. Now moving on to the filter, there's only one area in the filter. Well, I'll take that back. There are two areas in the filter where you're going to see leaks. The first area is around the O-ring. When you clean the filter, it's generally a good idea to put a new O-ring on. Some people put a new O-ring on every time. I don't do that, but I'll put a new O-ring on when I can see that it needs it. And how do I know when it needs one? Well, I'll put the tank back together. I'll use my silicone lube. And by the way, I use silicone spray on the filter O-rings because it seems to allow them to last longer and it's not as messy as magic lube. And for me, it seems that the silicone spray allows me to get the lid on easier on the filter. So I'll use this. I used to use the Boss silicone spray. Hard to find it, so I just use any RV gray silicone spray you can find at AutoZone or Pep Boys, wherever you shop for your auto parts. Just ask them, hey, where's your RV silicone spray? And that's what I use on the filter O-rings, and it seems to be really effective. So how do I know when a filter O-ring is worn out? Well, you can tell sometimes before you put it back on. If it's kind of floppy and doesn't go around the tank well, then it's probably needs to be replaced. A lot of times, the only way I can tell is by putting it back together, tightening the clamp, and seeing a little drip leak. And that's when I know I have to replace the O-ring. It's kind of something that, it's going to be time consuming. You have to take the lid off again. But there's really no other way of telling unless it's really worn out. And you can tell again by the fact that it's not sitting well on the lip of the tank. Occasionally, I'll run into this problem, and this is usually with the Pentair 4000 series filters. If the top was replaced or the bottom was replaced by a different part because of a crack, they had a little problem with cracking back in the late 2010s to 2015s or so, with these tanks cracking. And they're not really factory set together. I don't know how to explain that. I guess because they make the tank and the top together in one run. When you buy one after the fact, it's not going to be this exact same fit. So I've had problems with the O-ring leaking even with a brand new O-ring. The way I solved this is to put a red line O-ring on there, which is for the 2000 series. It has a red line in the O-ring. And by the way, if you have 2000 series filters, generally I change those O-rings every time I clean the filter because those little lids are so hard to get back on. It's one of those things where changing the O-ring each time you clean that filter really helps. So that's the only filter that I'll change the O-ring every time I clean it, which are the 2000 series stainless steel, tiny little lids that you have to kind of push on there. There's tricks to get it on. I have a video that shows how to get that on there pretty easily. But needless to say, a leak at the O-ring is usually fixed by changing the O-ring and by tightening up the clamp really good. So that'll fix that leak. The other leak that I see, actually there's 3 leaks now. I'm going to just take that back and say there's 2 more areas where you'll see a leak. The other leak source would be either a drain plug on the filter. I've seen this a lot with the Jandy filters with a gigantic drain plug that's totally useless. You have to get channel locks to get it off. It's like the size of a Tupperware lid. It's really crazy making a drain that big. To me, it's pointless, but that O-ring in there is really bad and it can leak. Other drains are smaller. Drain plugs are smaller, but you can still have a leak there at that O-ring. So I lube that up really well, and I have replacement O-rings for that as well. You'll see leaks there all the time as well. And then the other leak area would be at the pressure relief gauge or the air bleeder. Sometimes they get old and they start to leak. The Pentair air bleeder assembly is pretty notorious for cracking. It's really a cheap plastic. I mean, for the price of that filter and for the quality of that build of the filter, they have a really cheap air bleeder on top. And I do mean that the plastic is really cheap because if you over tighten it, you're going to crack the plastic. And always carry a spare air bleeder assembly. If you have a Pentair FNS Plus or Clean and Clear Plus, or even some of the single cartridge filters has this air bleeder assembly on top. So you'll have a leak from there. Sometimes the older air bleeders will leak even when you have them all the way closed, and just replace that air bleeder and pressure gauge and you should be fine at that point. Moving on to the heater, I mentioned the winterizing plug. That's a really noticeable area where heaters leak. For some reason, Pentair had a run of these really bad batches of these plugs for their heaters, and they would just wear out pretty quickly. I think the chemicals also wear these O-rings out too. I can't say really it's a manufacturer defect entirely, but probably the chemicals in the pool wear these little O-rings out. They're tiny, and there's not a lot of resistance, and I can see them wearing out. So that's one area. If you have a heater, check the winterizing plug for water dripping. Now, other areas in the heater Unfortunately, if there's some leaking coming from the heater internally, that could be a really expensive repair. There's a few parts in there that you don't want water leaking at. And whenever you see water dripping out of the heater from the center of the heater, that's bad news. That means maybe the heat exchange is bad. And if it's coming out near the side where the outlet is, then the outlet or discharge from the heater could be the manifold of the heater. Any part in the heater that's leaking is going to cost a bundle of money. Heater parts are expensive. And it's one of those things that if a heater starts to leak, it's a big problem. And sometimes you have to replace the heater because the parts are just so expensive, or they don't have the part in stock to fix that. And there isn't much you can do at that point. If the leak is really bad. There's been a few customers that I've cut the heater out entirely and just temporarily replumbed everything so the pool would be running as they kind of considered what they're going to do as far as the repair. But that's kind of like an extreme thing, and you can do it. I mean, it's not that hard to take the heater out and replumb it without it. It's just something that's a little bit more extreme. But normally you'd have to order the part. Sometimes you have to call a heater specialist in, and they can analyze it to make sure that it's something repairable before you spend the money on the part. But any leak inside the heater is kind of bad news to the customer. You may get lucky, it may just be an O-ring somewhere. But I've really always had bad luck with leaks in the heater. It's always been a pretty expensive part for the customer. Another place where you may have a leak is at your saltwater cell at the unions. Now, I don't know, it's hard to get these straight, I guess. And a lot of installers can't put these on straight. I've had so many accounts where it's so hard to get these unions off, to get the salt cell out to clean it. It's because they're just not on straight. And they should be on straight for it to work. So if you're having trouble getting the unions off because the salt cell is on crooked or the pipes aren't lined up properly, it's pretty normal out there. It's not something that's unusual. So you'll have to figure out how you want to get it off. For me, I put a rag on a union, and then I use my gigantic pair of blue channel locks. You can buy those at Home Depot, and I can't remember the dimensions of it, but it's like the opening is like 14 inches or something crazy like that, but it's fully wide open. These are great. You may need two of them, so you have one on one side with a rag, the other on the other side with a rag, and then you're kind of going the opposite direction with them to kind of get those unions off. Some people use the oil change filter wrenches. I've never used that, but I've heard they're pretty successful as well. But a lot of times it'll be leaking from the O-ring in the union because it's on crooked, and it's like you have to be, kind of scientific about it and, have one side a little tighter than the other and kind of move it around until you have it perfectly tight so there's no water leaking. It's kind of comical sometimes. You're like turning the union just slightly and then the water stops. You're like, yay, I did it. Other times it's really frustrating because you can't get the water to stop for nothing. You have to take the cell off again, realign it, and do that multiple times to finally get it on right. But it's common out there to have salt cells that are installed slightly crooked, which means you're not going to have that perfect alignment to get that O-ring flush against the threaded part of the union as you're tightening that nut. So there are the common areas where you have water leaking and what you should look for. And I always examine the pool equipment. Hopefully you can get there with the pool equipment off if you do notice a leak somewhere so you can kind of see where it's coming from. Sometimes when you're there with the equipment, you can't really tell. Equipment running, you can't tell where the water is coming from. I forgot a few other ones that happen a lot, which is the UV ozone system. If you have like a Dell ozone with UV and ozone together, or just even an ozone system, a lot of times those will have O-rings inside there that leak as well. And there's other little parts that could leak, like chlorinators and chlorinating tubing. But mainly for the equipment, these are the main areas where you're going to find water leaking when you get to a stop and you're inspecting the equipment. Looking for other podcasts that I recorded, you go to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. On the banner, click on the podcast icon. There'll be a drop-down menu of over 1,600 podcasts there for you. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.